Good evening. My name is Jack Self, and I'm speaking to you today from Paris, France, where I'm in a kind of temporary exile due to the pandemic. The subject of what it is I'm going to talk to you about today is what it means to live today. I mean, the first thing I want to mention is about the format of this kind of 15-minute presentation itself, which I think is interesting. I'm not treating it as a lecture. I'm treating it more as a kind of extended monologue, which for those of you who might have heard me speak or know me will know that I'm on home ground with an extended monologue. In that sense, I also only have one slide, which I hope and believe you can see right now. I'm not going to talk to this immediately. The kind of title of this day is Less in the Mood for Meaning, Room for Vibes and Atmosphere. And I want to deal with all of those different topics in their own way. First, I guess I'm going to talk about what it means to live today, and in the context of kind of current mood. In a sense, I would argue that when talking about the contemporary meaning, which is kind of the significance of our times, is inseparable from mood, which is its kind of emotional state. Then I'm going to talk about rooms and vibes and atmospheres. But I guess the first thing to say about what it means to live today is what context are we putting today in? We could look at this through different lenses. At the lens of millennia, I would argue that the current moment is part of a long-term radical turn. I mean, the meaning of radicality is to return to the root. This was invented by monks during the medieval period. They could see that things changed throughout their lifetime, but they also thought that God had created the world as a static and perfect structure. So they had this kind of disjoint between the obvious change they were seeing and a belief in the static nature of the world. So they created the concept of radicality, which means that over the course of someone's lifetime, we drift from God's plan, and then there's a kind of snapback, and that snapback is the radical, or the return to the origin. And I think in that sense, we already had everything we needed to have a harmonious balance with the natural world and with this planet. And we already had a very stable location within its ecosystems, which we've spent the last 1,000 years really disrupting. And therefore, I think we should, in the longest term, we should really think about how what has existed before might return, how we might make a radical move. At the scale of the century, something that I'm thinking a lot about at the moment is the Renaissance. Maybe some of you have seen in your feeds, there's a huge return of the medieval and the concept of the Dark Age at the moment, but I think this is a misreading of the mood. The actual mood is the Renaissance, because the Renaissance is, first of all, a cultural movement. It's not political or economic or scientific. It's a moment when a group of cultural figures decide that they're going to radically change the course and direction of their society and civilization. And this, I think, is really central to the moment that we have now. As Al Gore said more than a decade ago, we already have all the technology we need to avoid, global warming if we wanted to. What we lack is a political will. We don't need science. We don't need economic models. We just need a kind of a will. And I think that's really coming from the cultural field at the moment. That's also true, I think, in the context of the kind of profound civil rights struggle that we're seeing at the moment. And in that sense, I think there's something else about the Renaissance which is relevant, which is that the Renaissance is not a destination. It's a kind of a bridge between two things, between the medieval and the modern. And in that sense, I think the period or the century that we're in at the moment should be viewed as the kind of junction between the end of the industrial and what will come next, which obviously I have quite utopian hopes for. At the scale of the decade, we're really talking about what it means to live in a state of perpetual instability. That's very much the kind of mood. And so much of, I think, how we deal with our mental and physical health now and in the coming decade will be how we learn to be comfortable and have some peace of mind in the way that we can't control the things that are around us. I mean, the idea of the kind of 20th century agency in which you can, and it's ironic because I myself am trying to execute a kind of 10-year plan that I started just after the Arab Spring. I don't know to what extent this concept of agency will really be possible or is even meaningful in the future, if it ever was. Certainly the myth is gone. In terms of where we are in the year, of course, we're between waves in the pandemic. We're in the kind of eye of the storm in some sense. And so I think now is a time for restorative care, for finding some silence and peace and concentration, and preparing ourselves as best we can, given the fact that we cannot prepare for this state of perpetual instability. Of course, at the scale of the day, it's Wednesday, which is the midweek and the height of our focus, the moment at which we are most productive. I'm going to move very, very quickly through just a couple of trends that I'm seeing at the moment in terms of what it means to live today. This is just so you don't feel like I've skirted around the issue with these vagaries. Obviously, anyone who can leave the city is about to leave the city. We're going to see an suburban exodus. Can we make sure that we don't end up with low density suburbia? Can we think of a new way in order to engage with the non-urban? I think Ram's countryside exhibition was right, but for the wrong reasons. And of course, that goes along with working from home and the rise of that, because basically both these phenomena create huge pressure on the home in terms of how it's used and exacerbate the inequalities which already existed in society, to do with the nature of the type of work that you do, but also to do with whether or not you can afford a space which can make possible that type of work. Obviously, people are going to be traveling a lot less, and that, I think, is also going to create multiple times. I mean, we have a myth of kind of global time, which is what we're existing in right now. I think that idea of subculture, which really requires the difference and the distinction of time and space from one location to another, will see something of a renaissance, and time itself will be slowing down. I better move on pretty quickly. The second part is really about what it means to design today. And for this, I'm going to move very in broad strokes. Basically, what I'm interested in is rules and recipes and formulae. The reason for this is if you look at the kind of, I would say, the central pillars of architecture over the last 500 years, but you could argue back to Vitruvius, it's never been about creating a single style or a single particular way of doing something, because like that question of what it means to live today, as soon as you become too precise about it, it instantly becomes irrelevant and difficult to adapt. And I think in that sense, you could look at people like Zaha Hadid or Frank Gehry, and of course, they're very famous, but I don't think that in the long run they will be very influential. And the reason for that is that there can be no school of Zaha or Gehry. They're too singular and individual. In the same way, there's no school of Anthony Gaudi. It's not something which can be replicated. Unlike, for example, someone like Palladio or Corbusier or even Rem Koolhaas, who have always worked with the idea of method and repeatable method that can be communicated to others. And of course, I would argue that the kind of firms which have come out of something like OMA, which are MVRDV, Bjarke Ingels, Rex, Ollie Shireen, these are all kind of stillborn freeze frames who often misunderstand the relationship between method and style, and they become kind of snapshots of what is actually a kind of ongoing methodology. So the question then for me is, how do we generalize the priorities and conditions of how we design? How do we create something which is repeatable and which is a method that can be interpreted by each architect in their own way, where the method itself is stable, even if the outcomes are always kind of contemporary and appropriate and timely and timeless, as I would say. So here's my go at a recipe, and then I'm going to present very rapidly this one project that you can see on the screen right now. The first thing when we design, I think, is to always start from a position of power relations. What or who will be brought into relations by the object that you're going to design? And how can the designer or should the designer shape those relations? I think you have to ask whether the designer is a kind of conducive or an agonistic agent. Are you exacerbating and pushing relations which might already be present but which need to be made more explicit, or are you in fact resisting status quo, overturning expectations? Once you've determined power relations, the next is to think about space-time. Space and time, of course, are the same thing. And for that, you should begin by thinking about material reality and really examining what exists, because I would argue that all forms, whether natural forms or human forms, are the product of the kind of precipitation of power into space-time, whether that means reading a building as the kind of precipitation of conflict between finance and client desires and social expectations and property laws and historical context, environmental context, and so on. And you can see that object as a kind of direct precipitation of those forces, or whether that means considering, geological strata as being the kind of form that these power exchanges in the earth manifest. And of course, what spatial conditions therefore reflect the power and reinforce those power relations that you attempted to set out in the first point, and what period of time is necessary to realize them. Spatial relations are formed by rooms, and I kind of prefer the German word Raum, which itself means both room and space. And rooms, for me, when we design them, should be abstract, and because they are a kind of vectorial or tectonic manifestation of space. But then the temporal relation comes precisely through this question of mood. And moods are kind of fragmentary, they're momentary, they're very fragile relations which are formed through the emotional evocation of different cultural assumptions, let's say. The third point out of the four is really this drive towards economy. Having now established your power relations and thought about the space and time that they should occupy, how can we be economic? And by that, what I really mean is to minimize as much as possible everything that we do. What is the least amount of material that a form can assume? What is the most efficient or responsive or adaptable way? But this, of course, I think, matter and economy is a kind of systems design question, but I think we're also talking about economy of communication and not just economies of material or economies of finance. The fourth one is, I would say, once you've kind of determined those things, the question is really about leaving a kind of openness to your design. And the word that I'm using for that is affordance. Basically, every time something is made, you lose potential. So how do you then re-embody potential in the object that you create? And I'm opposed to functionalism, and affordance is really just saying, well, what does the environment make possible? The best example in architecture I can think of is you only look for the hook on the wall at the moment at which you need to hang the bag, and that hook is dormant there right up until the moment at which it becomes ready at hand. And in that sense, we're talking about spaces which can be appropriated and reappropriated by the people who occupy them, that can adapt to the different needs on a kind of temporal basis. So that gives me, I think, 1 minute to tell you about this house which you see on the screen. Which in a way, I hope can be kind of an example of these 4 steps. Basically, Real is starting a housing company called Real Homes. We're aiming to launch at the end of this year. And we have a new CEO called Nathan Clark. He is currently stuck in Mexico due to the pandemic. And he has, through kind of some strange relations, suddenly Real is able to finance and build this house. Which we're working on at the moment. So in the case of power relations, this house has to deal with a permanent state of exception. We don't know who will live there, whether it will be Nate, whether it will be other people. We don't know how long they will be there or what their relations will be. So there's a very indeterminate set of power relations in terms of the number of people and their relationship to each other. In terms of the space-time, on the one hand, we want to evoke or I wanted to evoke certain memories or ideas which go along for me with being right next to a beach, which, and of course the context of it being very close to a series of Mayan ruins. And this is not like a question of historical pastiche. It's not really about postmodernism. Mood is much more expansive than that, because it's able to evoke these things without relying on style. So, you know, I would say the mood of this is like a little bit Mexico, a little bit Mayan, a little bit Hawaii, a little bit Glenn Murcutt. We're talking about how we talk about this kind of tropical context, specifically in Mexico, but broadly around the world. If you look at the plan, they're extremely generic rooms, but they create very specific relations between each people. I'll be extremely quick here. Economy, obviously, you know, this, if you look at the monoliths which hold up this house, you might say, well, that's not a very good use, but actually there's very low embodied energy in a naturally found rock of this shape which exists nearby. And they, in fact, allow this house to survive for probably 300 or 400 years in an earthquake zone because of the engineering design. We're talking about a unity between the communication of the building's attitude and the performance of its form. There's a reduction of bathrooms, there's a minimization of services and so on. There's other forms of economy which are there. And finally, I guess the point about affordance is that we're very interested in how these set of rooms and their precise relation to each other allow for a huge amount of adaptability. Basically, this is a house that could be lived in, could be worked in. The form doesn't predetermine its use, and it will be perfectly appropriate whether there's 1 or 8 people living in it. Anyway, that's all the time that I have. I think that's hopefully what it means to design today and what it means to live today. Thank you.